Tonight we're looking at the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation. Victory in Jesus is the memory tool that I use for this, and if you've read the book, likely you understand why. Sadly, a lot of people don't even read the book. It is a difficult book for various reasons, and in a couple of subsequent lessons we'll look more at that. But tonight we look at it, and we're simply going to do an overview. But it is a book that, though there are things hard to be understood, it is one of the most encouraging books that you'll ever read. If you look at it and try to push the preconceived ideas out of your mind and simply see what the message is. And we'll talk about that, like I said, a little bit tonight, but in subsequent lessons we're going to look at a few lessons on some of the ways to approach the book, some of the various ways that people do, what I believe is the best, but we'll look and see if we can delve a little bit more into the overall message of the book. Now, it is, of course, a New Testament book, the final book in the New Testament, 27th book. And it is, of course, that book which concludes the New Testament. The date, as we shall see, is something that people contend about. But as always, I remind you that whenever we seek to be justified, we learn so many things from the Old Covenant. They are there for our learning. But if we seek to go there for our justification, we are severed from Christ and fallen from grace. So we don't want to do that. We want to use it for the proper purpose, that schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that work that we can learn so much. But whenever we seek justification, we want to go to the New Covenant. Now, as you look at the time of writing, there are a couple of different schools of thought. And I am not contentious on this at all. If God had wanted us to know and to be adamant and really fight about the date, He would have told it specifically. But I have my belief on it. There are two basic thoughts. One, that it was completed a little bit prior to AD 70. And that does a lot with the idea of what you see in the book, some of the conclusions you reach. They're not going to be doctrinal matters. Some lead to doctrinal matters if you're not careful, but that can happen with any book. But the early date, of course, would put you to making some conclusions about things that occurred at that time. And then the latter date, and this is the one I take, AD 91 to 96, under the reign of a man named Domitian, the Roman ruler at that time. Now, I'll just give you a couple of reasons why I believe it's a later date. And like I said, I don't go into this in depth. There have been massive quantities of material written arguing for both, but I don't believe you can get to either one and say adamantly, this is it. But I have my opinion. You might have a differing one. You find that under Domitian's rule that Christianity was put more under persecution than at any other time. Now, Nero did persecute the Christians. We know that he, I think I mentioned last week that Nero lit up the road to Rome by putting Christians on crosses and putting them there, and he burned Rome and blamed it on the Christians. But it was more a localized type of persecution. This one is a broader one. No matter where you were in the Roman Empire, it was a persecution that came about because Christianity itself was delegated as a crime. And so in and out of Rome, he persecuted Christians. Nero's was more local. Then also he exiled Christians, and that would fit with John. He put them to death, tortured them into confession of a divinity. Now, Roman emperors for a long time, I believe from Augustus, they claimed that they were divine. They claimed that they had some divinity, not from the God of heaven, but the gods that they conceived of. But Domitian was the first one that really demanded, and he even had a section of his armies that went about and demanded individuals fall down to the image that they had with them. And so he is known for confiscating property. You had to have a certain writ if you were challenged by his soldiers saying that you had fallen down before you could buy and sell property. And that coincides with several things within the book. But that historically puts it in that time. There are other things internally. You look and you find, as you look at the book, you find chapter 2 through 4, the letters to the 7 churches. And there you find that Paul speaks to the 7, or rather God speaks to the 7 churches through John. And he says of the church in Ephesus that they had left their first love. But if you look back to the writings of the Ephesian letter, which would have been about 62 AD, put it very close to the 64 to 68 time frame that the early date sets, you find that Paul commends the Ephesian church for their faith in the Lord Jesus and their love unto the saints. It seems unlikely that in such a short time, though it would be possible, but it seems unlikely that they would have then been identified as a church that had left their first love. And that should say first love and not fifth love. But you look at that, and that, of course, I think puts the date a little bit later. And then in Colossians, which was written about the same time as Ephesians, remember there were the 4 books that were written while Paul was in prison. The Colossian individuals were told to salute the church at Laodicea. But whenever you look in the book of Revelation, the church at Laodicea has nothing, absolutely nothing that is said good about them. They're known as the lukewarm church. And so those two things, I think, add to at least my contention that the book would have been written at the latter time. But you're welcome to study that, and if you can find things that you want to change me, that's fine. But it's really not going to change much about how I view the book and the conclusions that I reach in it. Now, the places of the book, you find, of course, in chapter 1 and verse 9, it says, I, John, whom your brother and companion in tribulation, in the kingdom and patience, was in the isle that is called Patmos for the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. So he had been exiled to the island of Patmos. And you can see that. Now, this area here is what you would call modern-day Turkey. And so he is on the Isle of Patmos, and he's writing to the 7 churches of Asia. And you can just go in order around to them. The church at Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. But these were all churches that he was writing that were receiving the brunt of the persecution. Like I said, the persecution had gone outside of Rome proper and now was just scattered throughout the whole of the Roman Empire. And so the exact location. But the book itself is for other people, not just them. Now, the book gets its name from the first few verses of the opening of the book. It is the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, note, you find sometimes preachers get tithes given to them and such, or they'll buy them, and it'll have the books of the Bible on them. If you'll notice, I haven't seen, maybe they've corrected it, but every tithe that I've seen, if it has the revelation, it has an S on the end. And the book is not Revelations, it's Revelation. It is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so it is that book, but the word itself comes from a Greek word that is apocalypsis. And so sometimes you might hear it referred to as the apocalypse. And a lot of people use that word, but it is a revealing, an uncovering, and that's what it is. The very first verse, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass, he sent and signified it by his angel unto the servant John. And so it is a revelation from Jesus himself given to John as he was on the Isle of Patmos to show unto other individuals. Now, John is set forth, as we've already seen, clearly as the author. In chapter 1 and verse 1, you drop down to verse 4. It also identifies him as the author. Chapter 1 and verse 9, chapter 22 and verse 8. All these times it's mentioned as John being the apostle. And I don't know anybody who would seriously deny that. You can always find somebody who denies something that's plainly stated. But it is clearly him that is the author. But again, we remind you that whenever we speak of the author, these are the ones that God used. Remember, we noted in 2 Peter 1 and verse 20 that holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. And that, of course, is a reference to the Old Testament. 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 is given by inspiration of God. And we've gone over that and noted that God used individuals, used their character, used the very words that they would use. And so there are things distinctive to that individual, but it is God inspiring them verbally to set these things forth. So, if somebody rejects, whether it be the book of Revelation, the book of Acts by Luke, or any other, it's not saying, I don't believe him. A lot of times you find argumentation about Paul. You know, Paul was anti-woman because he said in 2 Timothy, or 1 Timothy 2 and verse 12 that a woman was not to have a position of authority over a man in worship. Well, they blame that on Paul. That's denying inspiration. And then sometimes they'll get the similarity between books, and they'll say, well, this writer copied from this one. Well, that's a denial of inspiration. The similarity is there because there is a common author, heavenly, that gave these men the things to write. Now, the message of the book, it is written, as you go through there, you'll find that it is to the 7 churches. It begins with him amongst the candlesticks, which are identified as the churches, and telling them that he can take that candlestick, he can remove it, but then he goes on and speaks to the 7 churches. So it would have application to them, but it would also apply to anybody and everybody. That's the thing that we look in the Scriptures and we see the application, though there may be a primary application to a certain individual. For example, Paul noted that he taught the things to Galatia and all the churches. Well, that's the common thing. So all can learn from it. Now it's written, as you look at it, it begins very clearly that John is in the midst of tribulation. And as you go through, you find that there is a war going on. There's a battle. And we will see, whenever we look at that what that's pointing to is that the churches themselves are being persecuted. And so God uses this book to encourage them, tell them of an ultimate victory. Remember, the memory tool we said was victory in Jesus. Revelation 17 and verse 14 is really the theme verse, and we'll see that again in a moment. But you look at it and it says, "These shall make war with the Lamb, and he shall overcome." The Lamb, of course, is Jesus Christ. The battle is going against him. And it says, "He shall overcome, and they that are with him, called and chosen and faithful." And so what he's telling them is, you're going to be victorious. And if you hold on, even if it costs your life. Revelation 2 and verse 10, he's going to say, "Be thou faithful unto death, and thou shalt receive a crown of life." Well, that's something that's taught throughout the Scriptures, but in this important time of persecution, they needed this message. So the basic message, the great message of the book is that Satan and the world, they can't win. Doesn't mean the battle isn't going to rage. You know, 1 Peter 5 and verse 8, "The devil is a roaring lion. He goes about seeking whom he may devour." That's not going to end. There's always going to be a battle. It's always going to be that narrow way. But the assurance is Christ and his church, his body, are going to overcome. So I want to be with him. And that's what the book is really emphasizing. Victory in Jesus. I think I've told you before, there was a man out in eastern Missouri who, a new Christian, and he read the book, and somebody talked to him, and he wanted to read it, and he said, "Well, you need to grow spiritually." And he said, well, he just wanted to read it. And he read it, and they asked him, said, "What's it about?" And he said, "Well, you know, I really don't know, but I know that Christ wins." And that's it. I mean, you read the book, you might not understand all the figures, and hopefully after we get through with a few more lessons, we will understand a little bit more of the symbolism that is in there. But whether you do or whether you don't, the message cries out, there's a battle going on, and if you want to win, stay with God. Don't leave Him. And of course, that message is throughout the Scriptures. Now, key verses, verse 1, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass, he sent and he signified it by an angel unto his servant John." So that tells you it is something that is shown. If you approach this book, you know, I encourage people to do word studies, and you get into various books and you read these things, and God is very precise. But if you're looking at a sign or a symbol, you're going to have trouble. I mean, you may know what a frog is. You can study the Word, and it's going to be a frog, but whenever you get over to chapter 14 and you find that there's a battle raging and it's led by a frog, knowing exactly what a frog is isn't going to help you. But if you back up and see the vision that is being given, and the book of Revelation is a series of visions. So if you back up and see that, then you're going to learn a great deal. It's akin to what you've had illustrated. On there is a little picture of the church building here. Now, if I hold it up and you say, what do you see? I say, well, I can see a little red dot. And that probably means, and I can formulate a whole series of things by that. What does that mean? Well, it means that bricks are precious. That this one who took this picture was really desirous of letting people know about bricks. Well, I back up and I get farther out and I see the picture just like I would see the whole of the vision. Well, there's two buildings there. And there's a drive that leads up to it. Whoever took that picture wanted you to know about the whole of the facility here in which we meet. But if I focus in on one little point, knowing that it is a picture, it's not just a word, that it's a picture, then I understand what is meant. The book of Revelation has to be focused upon in that way generally. You look and he writes, gives us signified, he signified it, he wrote what was seen, and so he describes a picture. I can tell you there are red bricks, or I can tell you there's a hill that's covered with green grass, and there stands a tree, and here is a quaint little red brick building, and beside it another building with a steepled roof there, a high-pitched roof that is brown. I mean, I can describe the whole of it. And that's what the writer does. And that's what he says in chapter 1 and verse 1. We've noted that so many times people, as they talk about Revelation, they'll say, well, the reason that you and I differ is you won't take it literally. And we've illustrated time and again, they won't either. Unless it's one little point that they want to take literal. But then they'll say the rest of it is symbolic. But I want that point. I want the 1,000 years. I don't want the bottomless pit. I don't want the chain. I don't want the serpent. I don't want all these things. Those are figurative, but that 1,000 years is literal. Why? Because I want it instead of looking to see what the message is. And it all pertains, if you look at it, again, the whole of the message is the revelation of Jesus Christ. It's not a revelation of some millennial reign. It's not a revelation of this or that. It's the revelation that Jesus wins. And so I look at it, I look at those visions, those symbols within that groundwork. And then the next key verse, I would say, in chapter 2 and verse 10, and there's so many, I mean, you could look at. But in chapter 2 and verse 10, fear none of these things which thou shalt suffer. Remember, they were in tribulation. And so here, as he writes to the church at Smyrna, he gives, fear none of these things that thou shalt suffer. The devil shall cast some of you in prison. You may be tried. You shall have tribulation 10 days. 10 days simply means a complete time. Be thou faithful unto death. And by the way, that doesn't mean faithful until you die of old age. Put in context, you're going to suffer even if they demand your life. Even if somebody comes and says, you worship this or die, you choose death. Because then you're going to receive a crown of life. But if you reject God, even to save your life, you've lost everything. Jesus pointed that out. You save your life for yourself, you've lost it. But you look and you find that's really key, that again, heaven is worth it all. There's a crown of life that awaits. For who? For those who are willing to stand with Jesus. Remember Revelation 17 and verse 14 that we mentioned. These shall make war with the Lamb. The Lamb shall overcome. There's the certainty. He will overcome. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings. They that are with him, called, chosen, faithful. If that describes me, when he is ultimately victorious. Now, he is already victorious. He's already won. There's no chance of him losing. But whenever all things are done, and the last enemy is put under into his footstep, and we go and we be with him in heaven, that's only if we are called, chosen, faithful. If I have continued on, even at whatever cost it may be, I'll never forsake my Lord. Now, the plan of the book, if you look at an outline, again, you can outline so many different ways. But you look at this, and all would agree in the first 8 verses there is an introduction. It's telling about what is being done. There are symbols, there are signs, there are visions being given, and of course identifying Jesus as the source of them, given unto John. And then Jesus, of course, that faithful witness, first begotten from the dead, the Prince of the kings of earth, unto him that loved us, washed us in our blood. He's made us to be kings and priests. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. And then he begins the message. And this outline divides it into 4 different visions, 4 different aspects going on. The first, the Lord amongst the candlesticks and churches. As I said, he begins, you find pictures of Jesus amongst the candlesticks. You find some beautiful and sometimes horrifying pictures of Jesus as you see him in that first set of visions. And then as he identifies the churches, as he speaks to them, you find each one of those separate visions is also applied to the churches. But it is the Lord amongst the candlesticks and the churches which they represent. And then the second vision in chapter 4 through chapter 16, you find the Lord in the world. Here's a battle that's raging. The things in the world, the Roman Empire, I believe, is what is identified, that it is against the church, and there is a battle going on. And then in chapter 17 on through chapter 1, it focuses in on the fact that the dragon, the devil, he is the one, he's the source of this. So the battle is now looked at as between the Lord and the devil. And then in chapter 21 and verse 9, after being victorious, he is shown with his own. And here is the ultimate reward. Here is what happens whenever Jesus is victorious, and that which all have to look forward to. That's one outline. Another one, introduction, chapter 1, verse 1 through 8. And then in chapter 1 and verse 19, he says, write the things which thou hast seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be thereafter. And this kind of follows that as an outline. First of all, it's an introduction in verses 1 through 8, and then the things that are. Here is what's going on in verse 9 of chapter 1 on through chapter 3 and verse 22. Christ's presence with. He is amongst the churches, and he knows. You know, and we're going to talk, that's one of the lessons. He knows. But he is there, he's aware of what is happening, and what is happening to us, and what is happening from us, how we act. And then the things to come in chapter 4 through chapter 22. And this is Christ as he defends his church, and he is the ultimate victor. And so a lot of visions in there, a lot of things, but that's the ultimate message, that here is the battle going on against the world itself, against the devil who is behind all of this, and he is going to destroy the enemies. He's going to be victorious. And then concluding remarks in chapter 22, verse 6 through 21. Amongst them, the fact, you don't mess with God's word. You don't add to it. You don't take away from it. You know, there's always the temptation to make things the way I want. And the book ends with that warning. And then the admonition, even so come, Lord Jesus. And so those are a couple of outlines, and you can get very lengthy outlines. You can look at it yourself as you study the book. But I do hope that you and I both will not shy away from the book. But rather, we won't make it a hobby that this is the only thing we're going to study, but that we will take the time to read it and to look at it and try to glean things from it that can help and encourage me, as it did in the first century and in each century past, as people look and see victory in Jesus. Now, some of the lessons, and like I said, we're going to look at some in subsequent lessons. There are several different ways that you look at the book, and we'll look at those. You know, there are several different approaches. There are many things that we can look. People say, well, I don't understand what this means or what this means. A lot of those things, if you read the book, God tells you what they mean. And so we'll look at those, and it's going to be, like I said, a couple of lessons. I'm trying to get it down to where it's not on and on and on each evening, but it is something that can benefit us all in a manner which can be understood, and I can at least communicate what I believe to be found in there. But some of the lessons that we find, just right at the outset. Number one, premillennialism isn't taught. And the truth is, if it were not for the 1,000 years mentioned over in Revelation 20, the doctrine of premillennialism never would have been even conceived. That there is a 1,000-year reign, that Jesus is going to come back and establish his kingdom upon this earth at some future time. I know as I look at the book of Revelation, if I don't understand anything else out of it, you know, there's a biblical principle. Whenever I look, if I find a difficult passage here, and I find a passage that is just plainly stated, I'm not going to put them in opposition to each other. But what I am going to do is I'm going to translate the difficult things in light of that is plainly stated. So I can look, and I may not know what something says specifically in the book, but there are things that I can know it doesn't say. For example, I know that there's no such thing as a secret rapture. Yet that's one of the tenets of premillennialism. That one day you and I are going to wake up, if we're not one of the redeemed, that Jesus would have come secretly and captured his saints away, and we're here for the time of tribulation, waiting for him to come and establish a kingdom. If you find that in the book of Revelation, you got a problem. Because verse 7 says, he cometh with the clouds, kind of similar to what's said over in the letter to those in Thessalonica. Whenever he's going to come, and we're going to meet him in the clouds. And by the way, there it's supposed to be the secret rapture, but he's coming with the shout, with the trump, with the shout of the archangel. No secret about it. And here he says, every eye shall see him. They also which pierced him. In other words, those who, according to premillennial doctrine, are going to be left here, they're going to see him come. They're going to know that he has come. All the kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him. So he's going to come back. And it's not going to be secret. We don't know when the day is going to come, but it will come. And it's going to be something that every eye shall see. And then also tribulation. Part of the premillennial doctrine. We're looking forward to that time when this secret rapture is going to occur. Well, maybe it's going to be before the 7 years tribulation, or maybe it's going to be in the midst of the 7 years tribulation, or maybe it's going to be after the 7 years tribulation. Those are all different flavors of the millennial doctrine. Problem is, none of them are true. You find that the tribulation that the book of Revelation talks of, now if I go over and I look in chapter 14 and I start talking about, well, here's the tribulation, here's the battle of Armageddon as it's beginning, what happened to the fact that John says, I, John, in verse 9, who am also your brother and companion in tribulation? He's not talking about something that's going to come 1,000 years, 2,000 years away. He says we're in the middle of it. And then Jesus is going to come back and he's going to go through all of this. That tribulation is going to come, and then at the end there's going to be the battle of Armageddon, which if it's literal, it's going to be led by that frog, by the way. And if it's literal, it has to be a literal frog. But that's another lesson. But whenever he does come back, he's going to establish his kingdom. But why would I teach that if John says, I am in the kingdom in chapter 1 and verse 9, which coincides with everything throughout the New Testament that Jesus established his church, which is the kingdom, Matthew 16, verse 16 through 18, and that the kingdom and the church are in fact one and the same thing. And it was established on the day of Pentecost. So I know, I read this book, and unless I want to say, oh, the first chapter doesn't matter, I want to get over here to the good stuff. If I want to keep it in context, there is no premillennial doctrine. There is no secret rapture. The tribulation was existing then that he's speaking of, and the kingdom existed then. And like we've already said in the first verse, for me to go and take 1,000 years and deny the rest of the context is to disregard the very manner of writing that Jesus identified in the very first verse. And then I know, as you look through the letters to the 7 churches, he looks and he says in verse 2, I know thy works, thy labor, thy patience. In chapter 2 and verse 9, he says, I know thy works, thy tribulation, thy poverty. In chapter 2 and verse 13, he says, I know thy works where thou dwellest. You look and a lot of good things like that, and then there are also bad things. But the fact is, I look at it, and if I'm encouraged, I want to be encouraged by the fact that He knows. You see, those that are with Him, called and chosen and faithful, He knows if I'm not faithful. He knows if I have not been called, which, according to the writer in the Thessalonian letter, would be called by the gospel, not by some little secret message that God sent to me in a dream. That's nowhere taught. You're called, 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 14, by the gospel. That is the power of God unto salvation. So if I have not heard and responded to the gospel, this doesn't apply to me anyway. But if it does, then God knows who I am. He knows what I've done, and He knows the sufferings I have. He knows the struggles I face to live, but He also knows if I'm not living faithful. So it's an encouragement. You know, the psalmist said, whither shall I flee from thy spirit? And he was talking about the omniscience of God. God knows. That can be a fearful thing, or it can be an encouragement. Whenever I determine to be faithful, no matter what the cost, and you think nobody knows, nobody cares, go read chapter 2 through 4. God knows. God cares. In the end, chapter 2 and verse 10, in all of that, heaven will be worth it. Fear none of those things thou shalt suffer. Now that doesn't mean, you know, if somebody comes and they say, are you a Christian? You know, we've all heard of it being done by crazy individuals, and they come up, if somebody comes up to me with a bat in their hand and they say, you a Christian? If you are, I'm going to hit you. Well, am I going to be scared? Yeah. I've been hit with things before, and it hurts. Scares me. But am I going to let that fear push me away from God? That's what He says don't do. You can't go through life without being afraid of some things, but you don't let fear control you. So He's saying here, you don't fear those things that shall come. The devil shall cast some of you in prison, identifying him as the one behind it, that you may be tried. You'll have tribulation for a complete time, for 10 days, but you be faithful unto death. Why in the world would I do that? Because I receive a crown of life. If you want more information on that, go to 2 Timothy 4. Paul was ready to die. Why? Because the Lord Himself was going to give him a crown. You think John copied from Paul, or you think God gave him the same message? I think the latter is very clear. In the end, don't live in the past. Could have put, there's no retirement. Unto the angel of the church in Sardis write these things, saith he, which has the 7 spirits of God. You go back, you'll find that's a description of Jesus in the midst of the candlesticks. And the 7 stars, I know thy works, thou hast a name which thou livest, but you're dead. Don't be the person who has ceased working, and I've done all this in the past. Do you know what I've done? Do you know what I've accomplished? Well, you know, I know individuals who I look and I admire because of what they've accomplished in the past. Now, they can't do exactly what they did in the past, but they hadn't stopped. They're doing different things, what they can do. Here you find the church at Sardis, they just stopped. Done my part, now it's up to somebody else. Don't do that. It's important to keep on until the end. And then, I think it was Wanda, or no, it was Glennis asked me about mugwumps. Said, I've read the book of Revelation, and I don't remember seeing a mugwump. I told her I learned about mugwumps here, and it was Louis Ward was the first one who identified a mugwump to me, and I thought, what in the world is a mugwump? And he said, well, here's this old bird, and it sits, here's the fence, and it sits right on top of it. It's mug on one side and it's wump on the other. In other words, I got friends on both sides. You know, I'm not going to take a stand for anything. In chapter 3 and verse 15, he writes there, and here's the church at Laodicea, and like I said, there's not a single good thing said about this congregation. He says, I know thy works, thou art neither hot nor cold. I wish you were hot or cold. And he says, because you're not. You're lukewarm. You're neither hot nor cold. I'll spew thee out of my mouth. You see, if I think I can straddle the issues, there are difficult things to understand in the Bible. But the moral issues that face us today, the issues of worship, the issues of salvation, all these things, they're not gray areas as some would have you believe. But if you want to be a mugwump, everything's gray. Well, it could be this way or that way. We talked about this morning that God gave us a system of truth that we can know. So I'm going to stand by it. I don't want to be lukewarm, and I don't want God to spit me out, to vomit me up. That's the picture that he gives us. And then 144,000, I threw that one in. Sometimes you'll have Jehovah's Witnesses who will come by and knock upon your door. And one of the things they talk about how things are getting more and more terrible, and if you really want to throw them off, say, no, not really. Things are better. We know more about things going on, but really life is better. We have means to deal with things. They don't know where to go from that. But one of their doctrines is that this earth will never be destroyed, despite what Peter said, that the earth and everything in it will be destroyed with a fervent heat. And they say it's just going to be renovated. But there are 144,000 who are going to go to heaven. Everybody else is going to live here on this restored earth where the lion and the lamb roam together. It's going to be nice and peaceful. First thing to do is ask them, you want 144,000? If you find one that says that, it's a rarity, because they've all determined that those slots have been filled. But then ask them if they want to describe who that 144,000 are. Well, again, here's the idea. You're going to be figurative or are you going to be literal? They say 144,000 is literal. If you look in chapter 7, you'll find that they're of the tribes of Israel. Problem is, Dan isn't mentioned. If it's the literal 12 tribes, number one, they don't have a chance anyway. But then number two, why did God forget Dan? And then he named the tribe of Joseph. There is no tribe of Joseph. So you look, clearly, chapter 7, he didn't mean that as a literal statement. And then in chapter 14, he again refers to these 144,000, and every single one of them are male virgins. No women in it. And the only males are ones who were virgins. You look at the patriarchs, none of them. They weren't virgins. But then you go in chapter 20 and verse 4, and though it doesn't mention the 144,000, it mentions the same ones before the throne who are reigning, and it says they were beheaded for the cause of Christ. Well, that now does away with anybody in the Old Testament, and only those in the New Testament time who were male virgins who were beheaded for the cause of Christ are going to be there. Well, by that time, they've got another study somewhere that they want to go to because they don't want to study with you anymore. Well, that's one of the problems you get into whenever you approach this book as a different style of writing. It is a type of writing that is showing signs and symbols. And then in chapter 12 and verse 17, we need to realize that we are the subjects of attack. The pictures in the book of Revelation is that there was war made against Jesus. He thought he had destroyed Jesus whenever he early on tried to kill the young ones. He couldn't do that. Tried to stop him from coming forth in the Old Testament. Tried to stop him from being born. Tried to kill the child. Couldn't do any of that. And so now in chapter 17, or chapter 12 and verse 17, you find that the war is turned against the child. You look in verse 17, I'll get it here in a minute. The dragon was wroth with the woman, went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which to keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Who do you think that describes in the latter part? Those individuals who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. That was the Christians he was writing to. In other words, the devil is saying, this war, the devil thought that he had won, then he thought he'd won, he thought he'd won, he thought he'd won, and each time he loses, now his line of attack has come down to you and I as individuals. And that's something we need to understand. And in that, in chapter 14, You want to find the horror of being lost? Chapter 14, in verse 10 and 11, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God poured out without mixture. You know, this is, you read on in that, and I hate to read it at times because it's so terrible. The smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever. It's a terrible thing to picture. But he's saying that's what it is to be lost. John is studying on Sunday morning the book of Hebrews, and he's gotten to the point right in the midst of chapter 10 where he's going to end up, I think next week he'll probably hit it, that it's a fearful thing to fall in the hands of the living God. Read chapter 14 in Revelation, you'll find out why. But don't stop there. You go over to chapter 21, and here you find he is overcome. And now there is something there. And so in chapter 21, verse 1 through 5, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. He will dwell with them. They shall be his people. God himself shall be with them and be their God. He shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. There shall be no more death, no more sorrow, nor crying. Neither shall be any more pain. The former things are passed away. And he that sat on the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And he said unto me, Write. Remember in chapter 1, he said, I'm going to show you signs. I want you to write them down and deliver them to the people. He says, Write. These words are true and faithful. I mean, that's it. That's what I want. And that's what I want for you and you want for me. We want a place where there is no more sorrow, no more pain, no more tears, where we dwell with God. We read about him here, and people look and say, I just can't imagine what it would have been to walk with Jesus. Think about being with him for all eternity. That's what he wants us to know. And so the final thing, will I overcome? Victory in Jesus. How does it happen? Revelation 12 in verse 10 and 11, he says, I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now is come salvation and strength, the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ. The accuser of our brethren, that's the devil, he is cast down that accused them before our God day and night. Satan is railing against you and I. But he's defeated. He shall make war with the Lamb, and he shall overcome, and they that are with him called and chosen faithful. Jesus wins. And this is you and I. This is us, our brethren, all of us. We overcame him by the word of their testimony. They loved not their lives unto death. They worked their way into heaven, didn't they? No. I left a little section out there. Did you notice that? They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb. Remember I said this morning, all spiritual blessings in Christ. Did you ever consider Jesus, whenever he hung on the cross, the soldiers came and they pierced his side, and out flowed blood and water. He shed his blood in his death. You ever consider in Romans the 6th chapter that we're baptized into his death? You ever notice that? You ever think about when you contacted the blood of Christ? I can tell you. Whenever you were baptized into Christ. The word of my testimony. How do you know you're a child of God? For as many as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. That's the word of my testimony. What'd you do after that? I kept on. I lived my life, even unto death. You saved yourself? No, I began and I lived and I died trusting in the blood of the Lamb. That's what saves us. That is the victory in Revelation 17 and verse 14. Whenever the devil thought he had won, he had put that Son upon the cross, that blood was shed, and on the third day he arose, and by the resurrection he was proclaimed to be the Son of God with power, according to Romans 1 and verse 4. He's victorious. And if we look to that blood, love him, keep his commandments, love not our life unto the death, we're with him when he wins, ultimately. And we have that heavenly home. I pray that's what we all look for. God made it possible. Victory in Jesus. Choice is up to us as we stand and sing the song of invitation.